All right, here we are, babies. We are going to talk about bias. What types of bias can occur in a survey? Well, it does manifest itself in very particular ways when we do a sample for a survey. So bias is going to show up differently in sampling than it does in experiments and simulations. All right. So those types of bias that show up in experiments and in simulations, you're not really going to know because you're not going to know if it shows up. But when you're sampling, there are certain scenarios in which you can tell what kind of bias may occur depending on how you sample. So let's talk about this idea that when we compute our statistics from our sample and it reflects the parameter of the population, we say that sample is unbiased or representative of the population. So that's what that means. If a sampling method is unfair, we say that it is a biased sampling method. So what does it mean to be unfair? Well, when we're sampling, it means that there's a portion of our population of interest that may be underrepresented or overrepresented. So, for instance, if, let's say I decide to take a sample survey from Colleyville Heritage High School students, and I decide that I'm just going to talk to my 7th period. That's it. That's the only class I'm going to talk to for my survey. Is my 7th period necessarily going to reflect the whole population of Colleyville Heritage High School? Well, it's not, because it's an AP statistics class, all right? And it's a small class. And it's just not going to be representative. So that would be a biased or unfair representation of Colleyville Heritage High School. All right, so let's explore each types of bias and the problem that they create. And I'm going to give you some examples about this here in just a minute. Okay, so voluntary response. Voluntary response bias just means that everyone in the population is asked a certain question or given a survey, but not everybody is going to respond. So that just means that I've given you the option. I've said, here you go. You can respond to this if you want to, but you don't have to. So the only people usually who are going to respond when you give them the option of voluntarily responding are going to be people with the strongest opinions. All right. So if I send out a survey about something controversial like abortion or gun control or something like that, who are the two groups of people that are going to respond? Well, the people who are really far one way and the people who are really far the other way, because those are the most passionate and have the strongest opinions. So that doesn't necessarily give you an accurate read on the entire population. So when you have a voluntary response, it means that you're giving people the option of responding and they are choosing to respond. Okay, which means some of them are going to choose not to. Okay, under coverage bias. Under coverage means that for whatever reason, some members of the population are not responding or are going to be less likely to be chosen. For instance, when I first started this video, I talked to you about my 7th period. If I just chose them, well, that's under coverage because my 7th period doesn't include all of the different types of kids there are at Colleyville Heritage. So that's going to be an example of under coverage. And of course, it's not going to represent your population accurately. Okay, non-response. Non-response and voluntary response are two that a lot of people get mixed up. Because a non-response is when an individual is selected to be in the sample, but they choose not to participate, okay? Or they are not reached in order to participate. The difference between voluntary response and non-response is the idea of expectation. For voluntary, we don't necessarily expect people, we don't expect everyone to necessarily participate. With non-response, your individuals are selected to be part of the sample, and we expect a response from them. Okay? When we expect a response and we don't get one, again, that's not going to represent the population accurately. So non-response and voluntary response, they're easy to mix up, but again, it's about expectation. All right? With voluntary, I'm going to give you all a piece of paper with a survey question on it. I'm going to say, okay, do this if you want to, turn it in at the end of the class. A non-response situation would be, okay, here kids, I'm giving you this survey, make sure you turn it in, and then you don't turn it in. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go, why didn't you turn in your survey? Okay, so there's the difference. It's an expectation thing. All right, the last one is response. Response covers a very broad array of different ways that bias can occur. So response can be anything in the design survey, who's administering it, how the questions are constructed, anything like that that can somehow sway the responses in some way. So of course the problem, your responses are influenced or prejudiced in some manner. And this usually has to do with wording of a question. An example of this might be a situation like, how do you feel about U.S. involvement in foreign affairs? All right, and then you're given a scale of 1 to 10. I'm very upset about it. I don't want it to happen, blah, 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 all these different choices. But what would change if I asked the question like this? How do you feel about the U.S. being involved in affairs within the world that they have nothing to do with? Okay, now I've tinged it with just a little bit of emotion, just a little bit of, hey, you need to answer this way because this is how I want you to answer it. Okay, so that is a good example of response bias. Anything in the wording or how it's presented to you that could sway your response. All right, something important to remember with bias. If you take a bad sample and it is not as representative of the population as it needs to be, then this means that you can't fix it. Okay, you can't fix a bad sample. Bad samples are going to give you bad data. There's nothing mathematical or any otherwise there's nothing you can do mathematically or anything else to fix it. You can't correct for a bad sample. It's either a bad sample or it's not. And if it's bad, all you can do is throw out your data and start over again with something that's more representative of your population. So hopefully that helped you with bias. We are going to do some examples in class together, actually, because I want to talk through some of those with you. But the next video will be about sampling methods.